Inflation is an increase in the general price level of goods and services in an economy. When the general price level rises, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. Consequently, inflation corresponds to a reduction in the purchasing power of money. In the history of inflationary experience in Malaysia, 1973 and 1974 were exceptional years. The sharp oil price increase in 1973 and 1974 was the reason for the escalation of world inflation in 1973 to 1974. The substantial price increase in 1973 was brought mainly by the shortage of food and raw materials arising from bad weather and increasing aggregate demand. Consumer price in Malaysia began to rise and reach a high level of 10.62% by the end of the year 1973. In 1974, the surge in the oil price by over 230% put strong fuel on inflation, and the inflation rate in Malaysia was increased to its record high of 17.29%. Then, a year later, the Malaysian economy slumped into its Great Recession with a GDP growth rate of only 0.8% in 1975 compared to 8.3% in 1974. Malaysia experienced a second of high price in 1980 and 1981, which were due to mainly external factors. Oil prices rose by 47% in 1979 and 66% in 1981. As a result, inflation in Malaysia accelerated from 3.6% in 1979 to 9.62% in 1981.
In June 2021 to June 2022, inflation in Malaysia rose from 123.2 to 127.4, said by Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad. The chief economist, Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad, Dr. Mof Afzanizam Abdurrahid, said that the inflation rose 3.4% year-on-year because of the rising cost of raw material, especially imported one, and strong demand. This can classify as cost-push inflation. To another extent, the bottleneck in the supply chain and lack of labor supply, especially foreign workers, also affect the productivity and efficiency of the economy. In the MIDF research, the spike continuation in food inflation, which increased 6.1% year-on-year, was partially caused by the depreciation of the ringgit versus the US dollar, as Malaysia is a net food importer. Former Financial Minister Tengku Zafrul Aziz said the bigger headwind for Malaysia is inflation. He said inflation in Malaysia is rising caused by geopolitical tension and supply chain distraction in China. The economy in Malaysia is growing strong in the first 2 quarters of the year 2022, and the unemployment rate are falling. To control the inflation, we can see the Malaysian government has used fiscal policy. Minister in the Prime Minister Department Economy, Datuk Seri Mustafa Mohamad, said the government has implemented various initiatives to curb inflation and help the people face the issue of higher cost of living. Inflation in Malaysia is lower because of the government continued provision of a larger subsidy allocation of RM77.7 billion for the year 2022. The government will also provide electricity subsidy for RM5.8 billion to maintain electricity price. In this case, we also can see the Malaysian government has used fiscal policy to control the inflation in Malaysia. The government also implemented price control through the Keluarga Malaysia Price Control and the Festive Season Price Control Scheme. Under these schemes, goods where prices are controlled include sugar, wheat flour for general use, cooking oil in 1 kg package, chicken and egg, as well as rum 95 petrol and diesel. Bank Negara Malaysia also used monetary policy to control inflation in Malaysia. In November 2022, Bank Negara Malaysia raised benchmark interest rate as it seeks to cool inflation amid a prosperity growth outlook. Bank Negara Malaysia lifted its overnight policy rate by 25 basis points to 2.75%.
Bank Negara Malaysia said any change to OPR will depend on how strong the economy and price growth.
As we know, Malaysia is experiencing inflation as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic that has hit since 2019 until now. So, this inflation situation has had various impacts, including positive impacts and negative impacts to Malaysia. Firstly, the positive impact of inflation on Malaysia is economic growth. During inflation, the country's economy will increase. This is because when inflation occurs, the price of goods will rise. Nevertheless, consumers or society will still buy existing goods and services because it is a necessity. So the high price of goods and high purchasing power will encourage economic development. Malaysia's economy grew a remarkable 14.2% in the third quarter of 2022, supported by sustained domestic demand, a strong job market, and robust external demand. The growth was better than the second quarter of 2022, which recorded 8.9% growth and stronger than the 5.0% recorded in the first quarter of 2022. Next, the negative impact of inflation on Malaysia is that money loses its value. Money's value decreases as goods price rise. For instance, if you store RM10 under your pillow for 10 years, inflation will prevent you from being able to purchase as much as you could now. If we examine the worth of money from 1980 to 2022, we can see that it lost more than half of its value throughout that time. In other words, you can get as much for $1 now as you could 30 years ago in terms of goods and services. The decline in the value of the ringgit by -6.2% against the United States dollar is in line with the movement of regional and developed country currencies, which declined by -2.8% to -16.4% until last July. So here the data and chart of inflation rate and annual change from 2010 to 2021. From this data and chart, we can see the increase and decrease of inflation from year to year. We can also find out the difference between the increase and decrease of inflation from year to year. The inflation rate in 2010 until 2015 showed an increase from 1.62% to 2.1% with an increase of 0.48%. The inflation rate in 2015 to 2021 also showed an increase from 2.1% to 2.48% with an increase of 0.38%. It is clear that inflation in our country is increasing day by day. From the chart, we can see that inflation in January was 2.3% and decreased by 0.1% in February and March. However, it increased again by 0.1% to 2.3% in April. In May, it increased by 0.5% to 2.8%. In June, it increased by 0.6% to 3.4%. In July, it increased by 1.0% to 4.4%. In August, it increased by 0.3% to 4.7% and decreased again by 0.2% in September to 4.5%. It decreased by 0.5% in October and November to 4.0% in both months. Malaysia's annual inflation rate was at 4.0% in November 2022, unchanged from November's 4-month low figures and compared with market estimates of 3.9%. Inflation was stable for both alcoholic beverage, tobacco at 0.8%, while cost is for both housing 1.4% versus 1.5% in October. Transport is 5.0% versus 5.2%, and furnishing and household maintenance is 3.8% versus 4.1%. Meanwhile, prices accelerated for health is 1.4% versus 1%, restaurants and hotels is 7.0% versus 6.8%, recreation is 3.6% versus 3.4%, and miscellaneous goods and services is 2.6% versus 2.4%. Also, food prices rose 7.3%, the steepest rise on record after a 7.1% gain in October. Core consumer prices, which strip volatile items of fresh food and administered prices, rose 4.2%, the steepest gain on record after a 4.1% rise in October. On a monthly basis, consumer prices increased 0.3% in November after a 0.2% gain in October.